Liz.
I'm Megan.
I'm Hannah.
And this is the Sisterhood of the Traveling Book Club, where we read books to make fun of them.
And we are starting a new book this week called The School for Good and Evil. It's book 1 in the School for Good and Evil series. And we'll be doing chapters 1, 2, 3.
So we're starting with chapter 1. And I skipped ahead, so I had to figure out where chapter 1 began and ended. So we start with
it's
Sophie.
Easy to find out where it began. I mean...
She couldn't find out where it began.
I mean, that could be important, maybe. But, so we begin with Sophie, and she's waiting in her bed to be kidnapped. And she's dreaming about a prince with blue eyes and white hair. She wakes up to the sound of a hammer, and her dad is hammering boards over her window. So she is like, I'm excited to be kidnapped, and her dad is like, I don't want my daughter to be kidnapped. But so far in the chapter, it's like not super clear what the kidnapping entails. She's just sort of like hoping for it, and her dad's like, no, and everyone in the readers are just like, what?
Yeah, this is normal behavior for kids. We follow so far.
I'm just laying in my bed being like, yay, kidnapping.
If you were friends with Liz and I when we were little, when we had our 7 Brides for 7 Brothers obsession, it might be normal behavior. You know, like
waiting for one of those brothers to come along.
Yes,
I mean, every one of our Barbies kidnapped.
We're fine. We're adjusted adults now.
And fell in love with their kidnapper. That was part of it.
Syndrome to its finest.
We were so primed for it. Why didn't anyone ever try that? It's too late now. I'd be like, I'm sorry. I know what Stockholm Syndrome is. You waited too long to do that. So while they're talking, her father's like, you know what? Everybody in town keeps saying that you're going to be picked, but I think it's going to be this other girl, because if the schoolmaster, this is the guy who is going to do the kidnapping, is looking for someone who is good, he's not going to pick you. And I'm just sort of like, I mean, I agree with you, but harsh from your dad.
Yeah, like maybe she's mean because of your parenting style? I don't know.
Yeah. Like, maybe you're not good at this. Like, I mean, who's good at parenting? But wow. Yeah, he's like, yeah, no, there's this other girl in town. She's way nicer than you. She like brings her dad lunch. I'm like, okay, so people are only nice. Like, people only seem nice to you if it serves you, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Very pointed praise from him.
Right. After this, Sophie is upset that she's been woken up because she needs her beauty rest. And then it describes like how long and involved her whole beauty regimen is, which it's a lot and it's gross. There are a lot of animal...
The vial of blood part, I was just disgusted.
Yeah, I was like...
I mean, I'm into skincare, but I would never do that.
A lot of, like, this is a very non-vegan beauty regimen. Like, she's a lot of animal byproducts involved.
Peter would have a heyday, let's just say.
I did appreciate that she's very hung up on this cucumber detail. I feel like when you're nervous, you get caught up on stupid details. And she's just like, what if when I get kidnapped, there aren't any cucumbers there? Like, are there cucumbers in the forest? I don't know. I should pack some. So after getting ready, she leaves her house. She's also thinking about, like, her various good deeds that she does. And along the way, this boy comes up to her, and she thinks he's gross, basically. And she treats him very poorly. Well, he's like, yeah, you're definitely not going to get picked. It's that girl who brings lunch to her dad. And Sophie's like, of course I'm going to be picked. And he's like, well, if you stay, you and I could be friends. And she's just like, no, we'll never be friends. You're disgusting. And so he leaves all sad. And she's like, she starts to worry. She's like, what if the schoolmaster saw that and is like, oh, she's not good. And she's like, I'm going to have to do nice things to make up for that. So she goes to her friend Agatha's house. And she's like, Agatha's my best friend. And she knocks on the door, and Agatha's like, go away. I don't like you. And they, like, Sophie, it becomes clear that Sophie comes to Agatha's house and is frequently trying to give her makeovers in a very wicked, Elphaba, Galinda way. You're gonna be popular. And apparently she's bad at bleaching people's hair, which, you know.
Yeah, that's the thing, I think. Because, like, she doesn't do it to, like, be nice. She do it to, like, test the products out on her?
Yeah, I mean, again, I mean, if it's not clear, like, yes, her dad was harsh, but also Sophie's not a nice person. Like, that's also pretty obvious. Like, her various good deeds aren't so much good as they are judgmental.
Yeah.
Like, my good deed is to make everyone around me more beautiful because I think they're ugly. So Sophie and Agatha are quite opposite of each other. So Sophie is, like, very interested in her looks and is very successful at making herself look very beautiful. Agatha is apparently not beautiful, has black hair, and kind of avoids everyone. And so everybody kind of thinks that they'll be the two that are kidnapped. Well, they're talking, and Sophie's like, well, you're my best friend. And Agatha's like, we're not friends. Like, you just come over here and you're mean to me. Like, you make me test stuff, and, like, it's terrible. They decide to take a walk together. Agatha doesn't really want to go. She's like, if you upset me, I'm just going to leave. Like, because we're not friends. And they're walking through town, and everybody's, like, trying to be more normal, not particularly good or bad, and they're singing, like, a song called Blessed Are the Ordinary. And so, like, basically, you can just sort of tell that Sophie and Agatha don't really agree on anything, but are somehow friends. And it's also clear that it kind of started out as, like, Sophie doing her good deeds, and so it's not really a nice situation. But it does talk about how the schoolmaster does kidnap two children. One of them is good and the other one is evil. Essentially, like, the children are taken to two different schools, and in the school of good, they teach them how to become heroes and princesses, and in the school of evil, they learn how to be witches and humpbacked trolls. And she's like, it's obviously true because it's in the books. And Agatha's like, yeah, fairy tale books? Like, I don't think that's real. Sophie's like, I think the only reason you're being in such denial is because you're going to be the other person that is kidnapped. Like, it's going to be you and me. And Agatha's like, why do you think that? Sophie is like, well, I want to be kidnapped because I don't want to live an ordinary life here. Like, that sounds so boring and terrible. And Agatha's like, why would anyone want to be taken from their family? And Sophie's just like, why not? Like, anyway, she's just really interested in having, like, the fairy tale life. They're talking, and it's sort of funny because it seems like they both kind of became friends because they felt bad for the other one. Like, Agatha's like, why did you come to my house? And she's like, why do you always let me in? And Agatha's like, well, you always seemed lonely. And she's like, I felt sorry for you. And Sophie's like, you felt sorry for me? Like, I'm amazing and gorgeous and I do all these good deeds and like you're feeling bad for me? Okay. Sophie's like, well, I mean, I did kind of become friends with you at first just to do good deeds, but after a while I liked you. Like, I liked being your friend. And Agatha's like, we are friends? Like, that's so weird. And Sophie's like, well, it's okay, because like now we're both going to get kidnapped and we'll be friends there. Agatha's like, why are you so sure I'm going to be the villain? And Sophie's like, you're different. And Agatha's like, why does that mean I'm evil? And she's like, it doesn't mean you're evil. It's just that usually in fairy tales, different turns to evil. I mean, my favorite part of this is like Sophie's explaining all the ways that she's different, and Sophie's like, you dressed as a bride for Halloween, and Agatha's like, weddings are scary, okay? Like, and I'm like, I feel you. I used to have nightmares about them.
Honestly, it makes a lot of valid points. Like, I don't like people or going out in public, and I don't know, man. Yeah, like the wedding thing. I mean, I had a wedding and it was awful. I mean, it wasn't awful. I got married. That was wonderful. But planning the whole thing, I don't know, man. I can see where it could be a nightmare.
Yeah, weddings are scary. I don't know. I don't want to plan one. Now that they've kind of established, okay, yeah, we really are friends and we kind of get each other and like each other, they're like, well, I hope that we'll stay together. And that's how chapter 1 ends.
I mean, I don't know how they can really hope to stay together when they're obviously being split into different schools.
Right. I'm not sure what Sophie thinks is going to happen. She's like, we're both going to get kidnapped and we'll be friends.
I also, I wonder how this town has so much information on what's going to happen based on, they have, the title of the school on some logo somewhere, which is in my chapter.
And then they have the story
to
go off of, right? And, that's it. They have the logo
that's
and
it. They're like,
that
clearly this is what's happening based on the very limited information we have. Very confident.
It's obvious.
Yeah.
I mean, how could they not have drawn the conclusions that they've drawn? I think if I saw a logo, I'd be like, well, obviously. Well, and an illustration of someone, and I was like, I think that kind of looks like that kid that was kidnapped at one time.
Well, and just to assume, though, that it's, actually happening, it's not just a story they made up about the person. They're writing this, but it's real life.
Yeah, instead of being they're writing this, but really it's just that they kidnapped and killed my kid and then wrote a story about them.
That'd be a much more morbid.
That's the actual ending of the series.
Surprise! They're just imagining.
Stupid this whole time. Really, it was a serial killer.
The whole book is just the townspeople imagining what should be happening to these girls at the school, right? And then you find out that's not at all what happened. That would be really sad. Anyways,
it's a collective breakdown of all the people in the town.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a kid's book, but could be interesting for sure.
Okay, chapter 2. Okay, night falls, and all the children are locked away, but Sophie has started working on unbarricading her window because she just wants her kidnapping to be as smooth as possible. And then we go back into some exposition. We get the background. So the kidnapping started 200 years ago, and every 4 years, 2 children are taken. One of them is good and beautiful, and the other one is homely and odd. And at first they blamed bears, just all kinds of bears. Every year it was a different one. It's no, maybe these are special bears that live underground or mermaid bears. Or, I don't know, random bears. And
so
then
basically,
finally they were wait, no, this isn't making sense anymore.
So basically that part in Avatar where they're what kind of bear is it? It's just a plain bear. It's
just a bear.
Finally, the children in the village started to notice that the children being taken would appear in their storybooks as characters in a fairy tale. And one of them would be good, like the heroine, and the other one is evil, the villain. Once a year, a set of new stories will arrive in the storybook shop in town, Mr. Deauville's. And like, we already know that bookstores are just inherently suspicious from our previous stories, so I don't trust this guy. Like, and they like question him, and they're like, "Hey, where do these books come from?" He's like, "I mean, where else would I get new stories?" Like,
yeah, honestly,
this is normal.
This is real serial killer behavior. Like, why don't they suspect him as stealing their children and then writing up these books to cover it up? Like, oh yeah, your children are totally alive and doing things. Like, look at these books.
These books just appeared out of nowhere. I don't know.
Like, the town's still like, yep, definitely bears, but these stories are interesting, and we're just like, why isn't it clear that he's the murderer?
Different genre.
So the set of new stories would arrive, and he would copy them and put them out in his shop. And then on one of the boxes that was delivered, they found a crest that had the words "School for Good and Evil" on it. So now they knew what was happening to their kids. Back to present time. Sophie's all ready for her kidnapping, and she's even laid out cookies for the schoolmaster, which is what they call this unknown kidnapper. And then she's ready to go to sleep, even though she's too excited to sleep. And then Agatha, who's been hiding outside Sophie's house, trying to make sure she doesn't try to sneak into the forest to get herself murdered. It's like, okay, she's in bed. She's not doing it. I'm just going to go back to my house now. And she takes the cookies, which, fair. I would do the same. As she's going back to the cemetery, she notices that like the entire town's out standing guard around the edge of the forest to keep their kids safe. But they don't guard around the cemetery because they're like, that's not important. No one cares about that. But that's like an obvious weak spot in a perimeter around the town. Like, I don't know why you would do that. Like, no one's going to come in through the cemetery.
It's too spooky for a guy who runs a school called the School for Good and Evil. Like,
and for sure doesn't murder them.
I mean, maybe these people deserve what's happening to them. They're not very smart. Anyway. So then Agatha's thinking about her life and how people have always whispered about her and calling her a witch and a villain, and that she's going to go to the school for evil kids. So over the years, she just kind of grew more and more antisocial. But to be fair, she's also like super emo. Very dark and depressing. When she arrives at home, her mother has packed a trunk for her with all the stuff that she'll need at evil school. So, really happy, supportive mom who's like, yes, you're going to do great being evil. So excited for you.
Hashtag best parents. Yeah. Right?
Agatha still thinks this is all just kind of a load of crock, and she goes to bed. It's getting close to midnight, and Sophie decides she's not going to sleep anymore. She's too excited. So she gets up and she sees the cookies are gone. She's like, he's here. I need to go wait for him outside. And then meanwhile, Agatha is jolted awake by a nightmare. And so she looks outside and she sees a shadow slinking towards town because, hey, there was a weak spot in the perimeter, guys. It got in, surprisingly. So she hurries over to Sophie's because she wants to keep her from being taken by the shadow. But the shadow comes anyway. Starts dragging Sophie towards the woods. All the villagers are blocked from rescuing her because there's fire suddenly around them. But Agatha is able to like slip around it and latch on, and so they're both dragged into the woods. So Agatha's trying to save Sophie. She's fighting against the shadow figure. But Sophie's like, go away, you're ruining this for me.
Don't ruin my kidnapping.
Yeah. After a while, they end up being like tossed up a tree. And then there's this black egg at the top, which hatches into a skeleton bird thing. And then that carries them off through a storm until they arrive at the school for good and evil. And then it drops them, but it drops Agatha on the pretty, happy blue and pink side, and it drops Sophie over the dark, evil side. The end.
Dun, dun. Chapter 3. I wrote a lot, so be prepared. It was kind of a long chapter, but I also probably wrote too much. So Sophie lands in the midst of the School of Evil, and she's greeted by a scary-looking boy who wants to touch her hair. Which, honestly, that would be quite alarming, just to have anyone try to touch your hair, let alone someone as scary as she described. And so lots of children are being herded to the school, and she sees all the other children in the school, and they're all ugly and deformed. And then Agatha, on the other hand, lands in a field with tons of beautiful girls, and there's like fairies everywhere and flowers. But one of the fairies just starts biting her at one point, and she accidentally swallows it and then spits it back out when she sees how appalled everyone is. I mean, the fairy kind of started it, so I don't really feel bad about that one, honestly. And then they're taking...
When people bite me, I'm just like, fine, I'll cannibalism. That's my only option. Well, I guess it's a fairy, not a person, but anyway.
Do fairies have less rights in your eyes, Liz?
Well, I'm just saying, is it cannibalism if it's a fairy?
We need to start like a fairy...
I'm not saying that she should eat them, I'm just saying, is it cannibalism?
Someone's gonna watch this and start like a fairy union like Hermione did with themselves.
Justice for the fairy.
You can't just eat it if it's biting you. Anyway, so they're taken to the school by the fairies. And once they're in the school, like all these pretty girls start circling Agatha, and they're basically asking if she's lost. And they're like, "Where's your ticket?" And they all have these like golden tickets, basically, that like show that they're supposed to be at the school for good. And she's like, trying to think of a diversion. She's like, "Oh no, how do I like get them off my case? This is weird." So she's like pretends to be looking in her pockets and like searches for a long time. And then she just farts really loudly. And that does work. I mean, it does the trick. It does disperse the crowd, and they're all very appalled, and she starts running away. But she doesn't get very far, and she ends up just in the foyer and is welcomed there by a nymph. And then we're back to Sophie. So Sophie is looking at... She's in the School for Evil now, and she's looking at plaques of graduates from the School of Evil. And then she sees like all these famous evil witches from like the storybooks, and then below that she finds a boy from her village, and it says that he had failed the school. So there's different tiers, basically, like there's gold, silver, and bronze. And then there's this boy who had failed the schooling, and it happens to be a boy from her village. And she's like, well, what happens to those people who fail? Like that, because she'd never heard about them after that. So she's like, that's kind of scary. And then she sees that the new students have their own plaques. This whole time she's been in denial. She's like, I don't belong here. I'm beautiful. I need to go to the school for good. Like, I clearly don't fit in. So she's trying to like find someone to try to tell them that it's a mistake. But then she sees all the students' plaques, and she finds one with her picture on it. And so at that point she panics, and she tries to grab it from the dwarf that's holding it. And after creating a scene, a witch hands her a schedule with her name on it, and it's showing the classes she's going to be taking at the school, and basically proves that she is meant to be there. And she gets freaked out, and she tries to run away. And then we're back to Agatha. And Agatha's in the school for good, and she sees all these professors are beautiful, but she says that even they seem to a little bit to be confused about why she's there. They're all trying to be nice, you can tell, but they're all a little bit suspicious. Everyone except for one good-looking male professor who seems to be happy she's there and seems to know something that the others don't. And then they all have the same portraits of people who graduated in the School of Good. So it's like the School of Evil, but these are like the princes and princesses from the storybooks, basically showing the best who'd graduated and on down, and like down to like the people who didn't make it to princesses, but they ended up being like footmen or just like kind of side characters that were good, I guess. Not necessarily evil, but not princesses either. And then Agatha tries to tell someone, she's looking for her friend Sophie, that Sophie should be in her place. I really appreciate that, like, throughout this thing, like, Sophie's not really worried about Agatha. He never like tries to find her, but that's kind of been Agatha's thing, and so that kind of helps you see maybe she is in the right place. She is at least thinking of her friend and trying to find her. At that point, they hand her schedule, and it's like all these princess classes, like how to become beautiful and things like that, with her name on it, and she realizes that she was also meant to be there, and she freaks out and runs away as well. And so she's running, and she makes it to a tower, and she's being chased by all these fairies that are shooting webs at her. And then she makes it to like the top of the building, and she's
Creepy.
What?
I would be very creeped out by these fairies, the way they've been described thus far.
More like pests than like, ooh, this is a cool magical creature. It's like,
Yeah.
I don't want you in my house.
Yeah, biting and shooting webs doesn't sound very beautiful. I don't know. So she's running away from these fairies still, and then she climbs the tower, and there's like this statue of a huge prince. And so she like climbs up this statue to the very top, to the top of his sword, and then she falls into the pond below. But instead of falling in and getting wet, she realizes that it's actually a portal. And at that point, she's transported to basically to the view of the other school, the School for Good. And then she sees Sophie. So she sees Sophie running towards her from the other school. And they run to try to embrace each other, but as they're about to meet, they get struck upon by an invisible barrier, basically. So there's some kind of force keeping the two schools apart. And then at that point, Sophie's like screaming, and they're trying to see each other, and then the wolves from the School for Evil drag Sophie back. And that is where we end on chapter 3. Does anybody have any like final thoughts or things about the first few chapters? No spoilers, Liz.
I mean, I think I'm with you, Hannah. I think Agatha and Sophie's like goodness and evilness, their town judged it from a very like cosmetic or aesthetic view, like, oh, Sophie looks good and Agatha looks different, so we think she's evil, like, but just based off of like their thoughts and stuff, like Sophie comes across as just being very selfish, and Agatha has been more focused on her friend and trying to help her, so like it makes sense from that perspective that they're in different schools.
Yeah. I mean, the
or
other
that they went to the
girls
opposite.
in the School for Good also seem like mean girls, though, so far.
Yeah, that was something that I was a little bit confused about. Like, I thought in the School for Good they would be more selfless and welcoming
and stuff.
But
Yeah,
maybe,
instead of being like, you don't belong here because you're ugly.
yeah, exactly. But I'm wondering if like maybe they're bringing Agatha into the school to kind of show a juxtaposition and be like, look, even though she's not pretty, she actually possesses the qualities that maybe these pretty girls don't. Like, she possesses the heart of a true princess, and maybe that's where they're gonna. I mean, I'm just making up stuff that probably doesn't happen at all. But I like to make up stuff.
Sure, because I'm sure Sophie will make friends in the School of Evil and be like, they have these good qualities to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess like the whole like, let's divide people up into who's good and who's not, like, doesn't really work well with humans.
Yeah.
Most of the time.
Why wouldn't it?
I mean, maybe you live in a black and white world, but I'm excited. I think it's going to be a good book. I know we usually do like really, we normally do books that are a lot more superficial and silly. But I do think that this book was written well for the audience. I'm enjoying it so far. And I'm looking forward to it, which is not something we can always say in this book club.
Right? Like, I mean, I already read the whole thing. I really liked this book, actually.
What was your initial impression of Mare in the first 3 chapters? Because
I mean, that she was Katniss Everdeen.
Yeah, so we read the book, the Red Queen, and we had a lot to say about some of the character development and other things. But
Hashtag Mare's hot.
Yes, hashtag Mare's hot because everybody in that book seems to think the main character is the hottest, even though there's been no indication that she is actually attractive, other than that everybody seems to be obsessed with her.
Yeah.
Even herself. She also is obsessed with herself.
She's like, dang, I'm hot. Why would anybody think about anyone else?
Yeah. Anyway, I'm excited to see the character development. I'm also excited to see how they're going to make this a TV show, because from what I can tell, they seem to be like younger children. Are they going to age them? I'm wondering.
They always age everybody.
That's true.
Yeah, I'm wondering, because like the people that they've talked about casting are adult women, and I'm wondering if they've been cast as like the headmistresses of the two schools. Because the schoolmaster, well, never mind.
Don't, yeah.
Never mind. But like, because I'm like, why? Unless, like, I mean, so far, because I started the second book too. So far, nobody's that old, so like, I don't
see how that would work with the same storyline. Yeah, it's always interesting to see how they play with it, but I hope they don't verge too far, because I do enjoy just like the more innocence that comes with children. I don't know, I feel like children do have more of a black and white view of the world, like,
yeah,
she's pretty and good and she's weird, so that must mean she's different and gonna have an evil origin story, you know.
Yeah.
Whereas if they're older, like, it's harder to justify that.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, like, I think because it's clear that this book is already going to kind of explore our impressions of what is good and what's not, and kind of go into that, like, the gray areas of it, or at least, you know, that seems likely. I like that that it's written for a young audience for that reason. It's like, yeah, maybe your view of the world is black and white, but like, we're going to start with like a very black and white idea, and then show you that it's gray, that you can't be sure, you know.
All in all, I'm excited, and I'm looking forward to the next books. We'll see you next week.
Yep.